Hello and welcome to the Deadbeat Philosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Baumeister, and with me today is my good friend down under, Andrew George. Andrew is an Australian environmental activist, thinker, jack of all trades, worker, social organizer, writer, an all-around good person and good friend. We talk with Andrew on the cusp of a cyclone that is just about to hit his home neighborhood. So we build out from there to talk about climate, the human-built environment, resilience, sustainability, the past and the future, humans and non-humans, political consciousness, political organizing, activism, what the future might hold, and a bunch of other topics. So I hope you enjoy this chat with Andrew George here on the Deadbeat Philosophy Podcast. How you doing, Andrew?
Good, and physically on the edge of exhaustion, which isn't necessarily a bad feeling.
Okay, I know. After a long day of manual labor, like a good kind of exhaustion, right? Or would
Correct.
you say it's a like, is there a good or a bad? Like, tell us what you were doing today, because your circumstances are. I want to get into them and have us talk about cyclone, about climate, about life on the different hemispheres and on the planet. But like, what are you, just concretely describe for us what your day was about, and we can just build out from there.
Okay, so I'm in this little city called Lismore in New South Wales, Australia, and there is a big cyclone that's coming down really far south. Normally they hit the top of Queensland, which is the northeast of Australia. But yeah, it's coming down towards Brisbane, which is the capital city, a couple of hours north of me, and maybe even further south than Brisbane. And what happens with cyclones is that in the southern hemisphere anyway, the southern side of them, of where it hits the coast, is where the most water is. So we're basically looking at huge amounts of rainfall coming to this area, and Lismore lies in a basin where rivers meet, where rainforest valleys, like finger webs, like spider webs, just all get filled with water and converge, like in Lismore. And in preparation, I was already meant to be moving house this week, but basically this cyclone has now meant that by Thursday night we're going to have flooding here. And I'm moving into a wagon, like a tiny house that my friend gave me, and just had to rebuild the floor. And I'm not very good at building things, or not very experienced. So the last few days have been like building things in the very real necessity of needing to have a floor to put all my stuff in, to get out of a house and to get to higher ground. So a lot of manual lifting of all kinds of things and moving the last 2 days in particular.
For people listening or watching, that you can hear the grasshoppers, right? Or the crickets in the background. Like, would you quickly tell us about those? Are those especially active right now, or is it always like that at night there?
That's a good question. If I was really connected with place, as I maybe strive to be, I would have a very good answer to that. I think pretty much always of an evening you'd hear crickets. Like, I'm wondering if they're quieter over winter, but winter's still really warm here, so that's probably a really regular thing. Sometimes when it rains, you'll hear green tree frogs and other kinds of frogs. Like, it can be really beautiful at nighttime when it's wet.
No, very atmospheric. And do you like so the cyclone and this particular, like natural occurrence, which is like very extreme and affects the human settlements and like the human built environment there extremely. Is this a regular occurrence? Is this something that, in other words, like, is this just something that cyclically happens every couple decades or periodically, and you just have to see that as kind of normal, or is there something else going on in terms of an acceleration, or in terms of where do we stand? Like, how is this connected to broader trends of climate in the area, if it is?
Yeah, well, I think so. In 3 years ago, literally almost to the day, definitely to the week, there was catastrophic floods here that were 2 meters higher than any in like sort of known history or almost recorded history at all. And so you have a lot of houses here that are really raised up, but the water went through the houses, and people were through a mixture of like ill-timed warnings, or like warnings that changed, you know, and also to a degree some complacency, but largely due to warnings, but also some cognitive biases, you know, like things can't be worse than they were in the past. That took people really by surprise, and that was 3 years ago. So that was catastrophic. The river height was 14.4 meters, and 2017. And actually, a month after that flood was another big flood. So that really screwed people over big time, all like recovering and then just hit again. 2017 was another like really major flood, pretty similar, 12 meters high or something. I think before then sort of fades, like nothing too in the memory. Like it goes to 1974 and then 1954 as big floods. But the fact that people are expecting major flooding coming up, but this time it's to do with a cyclone, whereas those times were different kind of factors. And so what we're going to have is also fast velocity winds, which means it's sort of another element of danger. And I'm going to say it's going to wreak havoc on the coast. Like there's a high tide, and the coast is going to get obliterated from this cyclone, and it's a really densely populated coastline in this part of the country. So yeah, I can see how when extreme weather events happen, we can say, you know, it's because of climate, human-induced global heating and stuff like this. But I can also really see how people can say it's always happened, because it has always happened. And we can't really fathom this randomness of events, or have lived long enough to know that the frequency might be getting closer. Before these floods the flooding of 2022 and 2017 happened sort of like 2017, 18, 19 was like, and 2016 maybe was a really acute drought that had like ended with the Black Summer bushfires as well. So you had in this part of the world huge floods, devastating bushfires that actually burned like Antarctic, what's it called, Gondwanan rainforest nearby. So rainforest that's definitely not meant to burn burned. Then you had like everyone, the pandemic, and then you had massive floods. So this part of Australia is very prone to disasters, but the frequency of them is really coming quite close. And it's sort of tragic or ironic that Resilient Lismore, this organization, that grassroots community organization that's been really helping in the recovery, they posted in the local newspaper, like the March edition, like 3 years on, we're kind of done. Or like we're really getting somewhere with our like fixing people's houses. And tragically, that might literally just like it's and that makes me, it's a lot for people to go through potentially again.
Okay, let's talk more about the cyclone. I want to ask you about the sustainability of human settlements and the human-built environment in relationship to the non-human natural world. Is it the case that human settlements there have been, unsustainably built, or built in a way that really just isn't sitting in an appropriate, harmonious relationship with non-human nature, such that, how humans live where they live ought to be redesigned, or ought to have been redesigned from the beginning, so that things like this don't happen in the same way and aren't as traumatic and impactful on humans and non-humans alike?
Mm.
So in other words, is there, and maybe there are examples in the space of non-human nature where that sort of more sustainable, resilient way of, you know, cohabitating with nature and climate and rhythm and cyclical patterns does happen. So what could or should humans be doing differently?
Well, it's interesting. You reminded me of this, you know, imagination of a it could be pre-colonial settler Australia, which is pretty, or it could be like pre any humans on this continent. But either way, the forest cover was vastly significant, vastly different. You know, so much has been cleared, and all kinds of ecosystems have been degraded. Like the place where the cyclone's due to hit is a pretty populated coastline, hundreds of kilometers of suburbia, almost like cities, skyscrapers on the Gold Coast, right on the coast. And these systems would have been built in, you know, sand dunes, which previously were just a most amazing ecosystems, you know, like these rainforests down to the coastals, down to sand dunes, evolving, changing into smaller plants and all the rest. But just to imagine how resilient a fully intact ecosystem probably like would be to a devastating winds is beautiful thought. Because like what we're going to see now is like massive coastal erosion. As one example, we're going to see huge flash flooding and flooding, like that's going to smash through human habitated areas. Yeah, like the hubris of humans to build in, to just take so much away from nature as they have built things. It's literally just going to come crashing down around us. And yeah, it's sort of like fascinating because you can think of a cyclone as a really destructive thing, but like maybe they really, like a forest that's really mature and intact would sort of like bend and I'm sure get destroyed, and then nature's healing mechanism is like like we have blood clots and they have pioneer species that heal, and over like the vastness of time, it's just like us getting punched or scratched, you know, it recovers. Whereas now it's like this completely different scenario that's going to really smash industry, smash people, and that nature itself isn't resilient to it because of how humans have destroyed like the coastal ecosystems and the forests that could absorb the water and slow it down. So in terms of what we might do differently, a lot, right? But like, where do we begin?
I think and it's quite similar in the U.S. I'll just point out. I think in several ways, and maybe, you know, they're both these settler colonial nations shaped by that history and a certain relationship to the land that comes through, not through, you know, so-called indigenous peoples who have a long rooted relationship to that land, but by colonist peoples who had a, you know, a specific view of the world, and in particular like Anglophone, you know, English, Irish, and Scottish colonists and such, right, who often were governed or fueled by an ideology in the background that land, if it wasn't used, wasn't productive and didn't really have value to anybody, and it is good for the land and for people. And in the it was with the grain of nature. It was naturally justified that that land ought to be developed and perfected and used. And so humans ought to do it. And if indigenous peoples there were already living there, the idea was that if they weren't developing the land, then they were misusing that land. Or so it kind of was used as a justification, like a condemnation of the inherent unproductivity of, you know, indigenous Australians, Americans, and many other indigenous peoples. But that sort of attitude that you got to make the most of the land, and it pervades today. I mean, look at Trump and the mineral deal in Ukraine. there's just, it's geopolitically important. It's how people today, I think, in positions of power, at least in, I mean, we could talk about the global politics of it, but it's very, very entrenched, this idea that the land belongs to humans and the land ought to be used, and it's the productivity of the land maximized. So, but that's what got us into this problem, environmentally speaking. And so, you know, do we need to change that attitude, or are there other ways to get us out of this? Because it seems in some ways, if we need to change that attitude, like,
yeah, well, this is a
lot of people hold that attitude.
This is the exciting part. Like, so, yeah, to tie it, although I would love to talk about some connections with First Nations, Indigenous Australians and stuff, but like to tie it back to a cyclone or a big disaster, the first thing it does is just take away people's material possessions. Like, and the more you have, the way bigger hassle it is to prepare, the more you have to sort of lose. And I just think that currently, you know, there's a big disaster, like the last floods here, and then everything gets destroyed. Like, but I mean, sentimental things get destroyed, but also like white goods, the couches, the beds, all of this stuff reaccumulates because we just live in an overly affluent, materialistic society. Like, the op shops are throwing stuff away because there's too much stuff. You know, it's like hyper overproduction. But anyway, I think, yeah, through losing stuff and through having to constantly prepare and live with disasters, you know, how many times does your house burn down or get flooded or a cyclone or whatever? Like, this might not affect heaps of people, but it will affect more and more people, guaranteed. That, like, we might actually lead to a less materialistic reality. And I think that maybe this is a long-term process. It might take hundreds of years to re-evolve a culture that is away from materialism, which, you know, I guess hopefully that links up with the larger political system, which is political capitalist system, I guess, which is accruing resources to produce things for profit and all the rest. But at the individual level, I think changes come about through these things, and then I actually think that can coalesce as like revolutionary forces as well, as people's lives get more and more severely disrupted. It'll be like, why am I enslaved to work to buy this shit that's just going to get destroyed anyway? Something like that. I'm not sure, but things have to change. And the disruptions that we're going to face are going to force the change. And the fascinating question is kind of what weird new things will evolve in different places, whether it'll continue as a globalized, like the hegemonic sort of current trend, or more likely new human ways of being will emerge as we potentially get like deglobalized through economic collapse or something.
Yeah, I guess that's one of the big questions for me, is what will those new human cultures be? Because it seems there is just radical disruption on the planet right now. So ecologically, if you're attuned to that, there certainly is. But politically and geopolitically, I mean, as you know, we're speaking with just everything that's happening in Europe with the Ukraine war, and you know, you could talk about a global rise of authoritarian fascism, and which carries its own, usually very, you know, anti-environmental, climate denialist ideology, and so it's all connected. But what is going to be that emerges? Because I feel that it takes catastrophe, and maybe things just get bad enough that it does force culture change. But that culture change could be that people learn the right lesson, maybe, and live better, more sustainable lives that are simpler, and that are more resilient, maybe because they're forced to. Or maybe there's like a, you know, techno-fascist, futurist alternative that's just basically, let's waste the planet, we'll build rocket ships and go colonize other planets, and we'll make it work, we'll mine all the minerals, we'll survive, a dystopian future. And that becomes palatable due to the ideology and kind of culture of that system. So what's your view of maybe if there is that fork in the road? Like, and I personally, that's just how I feel. It's very unpredictable what exactly is going to come. And, this kind of rightward shift that seems very possible in Europe and other places. I don't know, there's that trajectory there that I'm quite afraid of that. But maybe that's, I don't want to overemphasize that. So I know you've thought about this as well. And so what might be some thoughts that you have to share on this?
Yeah, well, a friend is doing his PhD on like how the climate movement is envisaging the future of democracy. And as part of his research, he's also looking at like far right movements. And he, brought my attention to the sort of tech bro Silicon Valley realm and how they really do have a vision of the future, this techno authoritarian future, perhaps. They're working towards it. I can't remember the sort of groups and projects, but there was like real specific sort of movement. And, there seems to be perhaps on the left, or what you could call maybe the pro-social side, if you're contrasting it with authoritarianism, like a pro-social side, perhaps a gap in how we're envisaging the future. And I sort of feel that and kind of see it, like in my day-to-day life, it's just this like trudging along, like it's kind of pretty egalitarian and communitarian the way I live, but it also doesn't feel like it's at all got the momentum to withstand or create something really bigger. Like, I don't know, maybe there's lots of humans that I have a lot of faith in humans generally. The everyday anarchism, everyday communism, I think that David Graeber mentions is a really cool concept that humans exhibit.
Mm-hmm.
But this sort of idea that we need a big story of how to live on this planet. And I'm sort of really into the kind of Leninist idea, or the idea that you need to really have a tight organization to build to a degree like a revolutionary force to go in a good direction, as a real countenance to the authoritarianism that's rising anyway. The left needs to be seriously organized, I would say, but at the same time the organic anarchistic things that are emerging, ecological kind of things as well. That this is the fundamental point. I really love this idea that Tim Hollow, this sort of anarchist Greens writer, thinker in Australia, said, which is like, as this big disruptions happen, what is underneath can thrive, like can emerge. And so it might seem like what small community groups are doing is pretty small or whatever, but in actual fact, when things really topple, they will really be able to shine. Maybe like community gardens or something like that, but maybe more like how people organize can emerge through the disruptions. And on that note, that's what's actually kind of exciting about right now, because we've started this thing called the Lismore People's Assembly to try and bring people together in like grassroots democracy, talking about important issues. How can we address the housing crisis locally, for example, with the sort of idea that like if we have a established organization, if the flood, when the last flood hit, there was an assembly, a big community assembly. All these people gathered with all these ideas of how they wanted to do things differently. Holy crap, we've got to reforest the catchments and all this. But that energy didn't continue. And perhaps because the organization wasn't established enough, there was no, way for that momentum to continue. And so hypothetically, if the freaking flood happens really bad now, I'm here as other really pretty active organizers here in this area as well, it might be a chance to start pushing for a different way of being, a different way of doing things, you know, because, for example, there's 3 years since the last big flood. The government, the bureaucracy, and the sort of disaster capitalism has been a terrible story, a terrible reality, and it's feasible that things could have been different in 3 years if people had been involved, if there was a community-led government system rather than some pretty toxic top-down stuff.
Yeah, no, and that seems like a great example of how the present moment is providing opportunities, or there's like windows and doors opening in terms of, because insofar as the ground is shifting, that means there's room for people to move into different positions, and for different things become possible, and maybe urgent and necessary. But as you also point out there's something to be said for, maybe we can learn from mistakes of the past, and you realize that, well, had we done this or tried to do things this way or organize in this way a decade ago or two decades ago, maybe in these concrete cases, better decisions would have been made. So it's not just to release the past from all culpability, or any of the problems that are there, but it is to say that you got to take the opportunities when you have them, and you shouldn't focus too much on the mistakes of the past, and should maybe just be open to exploring the potential of new creative things, you know.
Yeah, and I'm just seeing right now, because this funny scenario has emerged in Lismore, which is getting the most attention, getting a lot of attention, which is that like a street of houses that have been bought back by the government have been squatted by people from, firstly, quite a few people from international, like backpackers, but definitely quite a few Australians. Anyway, I only raise that because that's a really common criticism from the right people of town, is like, they're just backpackers, they're not even flood affected people, they're not even Aussies, you know, this really xenophobic narrative. But what I'm actually realizing, like, it's been a sort of ecological niche that's emerged. The government bought these flood vulnerable houses that were fully cleaned up and lived in post the 2022 flood, but they were sitting there empty and boarded up with a lawnmower man coming around mowing the lawns. And then people started occupying them and living in them, and created a massive community, a beautiful, pretty amazing community, like a unique sort of experience of humanity is this Pine Street community. But there's big criticism of it as well from people on the right, you know, people maybe jealous of this street of people having a good time living there in the middle of a ongoing recovery that has definitely been unfair for different people, has been slow, whatever. But what I'm just realizing now is, like, if you were to start afresh with a new disaster, you could point out the squatting as potentially an undesirable consequence, just like the disaster capitalism and bureaucracy, like, which to a degree it is, like, at least in terms of people's values, or like if they had just relocated the houses, then people wouldn't have had to squat them. So I'm just seeing the potential middle ground to try and bring people together, because like the sort of self-critique of the sort of this left outcome, which is the squatting, which has stirred up a lot of conservatives. But in fact, you know, it's like, there's maybe room to bring people in if we're just like, there's a lot of things that people might disagree with how things have gone. And what are we going to do this time?
So, Andrew, just before the break, we were chatting about geo-environmental politics, and a question emerged that could be put succinctly as reform or revolution, you know, to get to a better place in terms of the human's relationship to nature. Some change needs to happen. Like, that seems to be in agreement that there is a problem, something's out of whack. If we can agree to that, then something new needs to emerge. So what's the best way to get to that new? Broadly speaking, through reform, through taking a system as it is and trying to change it from the inside and maybe bend it and update it, or a revolution, like kind of a fresh start. That maybe which one? I mean, and obviously those could look very, very different and different sorts of things. But what's your kind of thoughts about that?
I think what we have in like the United States and Australia and probably maybe the UK, not sure, maybe other places, but it's like this partyocracy. Like it's not really a democracy. It's like two parties, which are very similar in outcomes. Maybe not the details, but the general trend of the planet is everything bad is accelerating, everything good is getting worse, perhaps, like generally speaking. So, but yeah, this question is kind of alive at the moment because some colleagues want to do this campaign because we have an election coming up here soon. And they're keen to do a campaign to attempt to sort of reach people who feel disengaged with the existing system and try and sort of mobilize them by taking action during a political campaign, like a federal election cycle. And this one of the current names for this project is CATS, Campaign Against the System. And it sort of is coming up against the reformist line, which for me is just this interesting tension, which is that like we have the Greens Party in Australia. Some Greens people I know, like most Greens people I know, are really cool and really fully agree with them and stuff, but they are working with the system. And
yeah, you know, it's nice that Australia has a Green Party. Would you say that party's healthy?
Healthy. Well, the last election they won heaps more seats than they had before. But I think to some degree, like the ineptitude, the inability of the existing system to sort of fix itself, to create better democracy, to stop favoring corporations, is or the rising inequality crisis, the rising housing crisis, the climate crisis, like. These are so embedded in the political system that, and they're causing such grievances in society right now that, like, I think the Greens aren't necessarily. I would be surprised if they're going to get re-elected in the places where they were elected. Some of them, because I think people's material conditions are really going down. That like the whole system is sort of culpable, and people are just going to be turning from Greens to like Labour Party, the ostensibly left party. So I just think the credibility of the entire system is so low that to a degree revolution is going to be necessary. And there's this proposal from Roger Hallam, co-founder of Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil and other big, really successful, disruptive, nonviolent campaigns, who's currently serving 5 years in jail for conspiracy to disrupt an airport to prevent, climate collapse.
He's able to publish a newsletter from in jail, and I believe is writing very actively and has as for people who might be listening to this from the vantage of philosophy, I think Roger Hallam is recommendable as a thinker as well, and doesn't get much traction within academic environmental theory and writing and things, but I think could, and is grappling with the problems on a great, whether or not you agree with his view, he's really addressing things head on in a way that a lot of people, or very few people, are.
Yeah, from prison, he's found he's totally at peace and able to read and write and keep communicating, and it's pretty amazing. But what he proposes, which is just like people going out and communicating like how fucked the system is and how much there is a need for revolution and how much we need to transform everything. Like, you might not get that much traction to begin with, but like you keep going, you keep going, you keep going. You've got like, you know, a small following, tens of thousands of people say. But then when these huge disruptions come and the political system is just left like gaping because it isn't able to like solve it anymore, suddenly you've been there all along, kind of saying, you know, the ecological crisis is fucking real. We need to, you know, have a massive transformation of everything. So you have legitimacy through like actually sticking to that from now on, you know. And then yeah, it's this sort of Leninist idea that if you have a organized organization, organized system that can act quickly, make decisions, hold true to its like vision, which doesn't have to mean it's a dictatorship. It could be a vision based on like lots of citizens' assemblies, random selection, all kinds of democratic things. But anyway, yeah, hold true to that at the time when these huge disruptions come, because yeah, the economic failure is going to happen with more and more climate disasters, and that's going to mean people on the streets super upset. And yeah, once again, if we're not there, if someone's not there with a good plan and a just plan, then they are going to scapegoat people. And I think, and we're going to turn on each other. And I think in terms of like, as you mentioned, the possible scenarios of the future, you know, the one that's not dematerializing, living communally, sharing, having less, focusing on healing the planet rather than accumulating wealth or extracting things, like a seemingly possible alternative is horrific. You know, it's like kill everyone so there's less people to stay safe, and the ones who have the means will be the ones to stick around. And yeah, that does not sound good. I really don't want that to happen, even though it probably already is happening in some places.
Yes, yeah, like a fundamental breakdown of, I don't know, I won't say human civilization, but of you know, like of security and of you know, maybe yeah, of human society. But let me shift here to a related question. This is something I've asked a lot of the people I've interviewed in these you know, first set of episodes here, which is about death. How do you feel about death, your own death, death in general? What's your relationship with it? And it could connect with what we were saying. I mean, you know, being a climate activist or someone who attends to these topics, especially, you know, of extinction, and kind of grapples and tries to think directly about the stark realities, is faced with death to a certain extent and must, you know, accommodate oneself with that, I guess. So how do you do that? And then maybe also personally, like, you know, as you've, you know, where you are in your own life story, do you fear death? What do you think about your own death? Any of that. So, yeah, open invitation. What do you got to say?
Yeah, well, generally, death is an exciting thought for me. For my personal death, it's just like, wow, what'll happen then? Clearly, the answer is definitely nothing, partially, but at the same time, it gives me a little sense of awe, even just to fathom that. I love the Alan Watts line, I think, which is like going to sleep, never waking up. Just like at the start of our life, we woke up having never gone to sleep. It's so trippy. But that's
nice.
Yeah. Like I can imagine, I guess I haven't had much death around me. A really good friend committed suicide a while ago, and that was very painful, and definitely for the immediate times, you know, you would feel this absence of this person no longer there to share their magic in my life. And I can imagine that's how it is when people you really love and like die, that there's a loss and a missing part there, which to this point I'm not so familiar with but will inevitably increase. Yeah, and I think as much as I'm very, very concerned with the suffering and the story of the world right now, and what I see as pretty shocking suffering coming along. Actually, a really good friend points out that like the world has already gone through so much suffering, slavery and colonization and the extreme poverty that 800 million people, I think, live in every single day. Presumably there's a fair bit of suffering there. But basically, like, the worst things that could happen have already happened, do already happen. Not to diminish, I think, the potential of what's coming, but just to put it in perspective that, yeah, like, it's all a bit of a tragedy. But a tragedy is pretty close to an irony, which brings one to laugh.
Yes, yeah. There's a thin blue line there separating those two, so to speak. One follow-up question I have with you about that. So, like, I love that description of the world, the human world. You know, it's been this almost like comedy of errors from the beginning, with, you know, not to trivialize it, but in the sense that there's, I mean, it's almost like a joke how much suffering there has been, and that's like, you know, like a lot of philosophers throughout history have made that observation. Some of the people who I've studied, like in classical German philosophy, Kant and then Hegel, you know, this podcast is sponsored by the Hegel House Museum, hold this view that basically they think that things will get better as the future goes on, and that, you know, that humans have made genuine progress in all this, and that, you know, that's certainly Kant's and Hegel's view of history. But then people today like Steven Pinker and others have a very positive, optimistic view of the present, you know, that there's never been so little suffering proportional for humans, or that the, you know, the life expectancy or these sort of metrics, it depends on how you measure it. So, but I like this counter idea, which is that, well, we don't know exactly what's coming. You know, there's no guarantee that things always get better. And it seems that we're on the cusp of suffering as you've experienced in the past. And that in a certain way, the whole planet works that way too. If you think about extinction, cycles of extinction, not just for humans, but for non-human species and creatures of all kind, such that if you kind of put it in the broader the frame you take, then any kind of attempt to pick out a pattern that things are improving or not seems foolish in some ways. And I don't know, but there seems to be a broader background constant of death, suffering, extinction. I mean, not to be too a negative Nancy here, but in any way, that seems more common than not. So maybe going into ecological, geopolitical catastrophe, or, you know, the Trumpocalypse, who knows where all this is going to lead, but it could be bad, but in a certain sense, maybe that's just the course of nature. I don't know. Yeah, that might be over. So what do you think about that? Like, or do you find grounds to, like, you know, you don't just want to lean into the death of it all, the kind of necessity, the natural, the fact that it's all, you know, seems to be crumbling and it will crumble. What do you have in you that stands up against that?
Well, it's interesting to imagine, like, in a species going extinct, and that meaning, you know, that, like, the last one of this creature didn't find the last other one that it could procreate with, or like in the most dramatic case, right? Like, the last male and female penguins, the female's dead and the man is just walking around, and there's nothing to procreate with, and there's no offspring. Like, yeah,
that happened with the white rhino, I believe, or recently it's happened with a couple, you know, severely, you know, on the functionally extinct species.
Yeah.
So,
And
but what do
obviously,
you like to think about that? So like you just picture that as
well, just sort of like like a gaping sadness, but like at the same time, yeah, you know, there's a lot of humans, for example, so we don't have to worry about that at this point for humans. Um, but yeah,
if anything, there's too many of us. I mean, I don't know, that's maybe a controversial argument, but like, you know, we've so overpopulated the planet. Like, I think human beings are also very high. Just our biomass is more than, I need to look at these charts or something, but it's like, you know, I don't know. Yeah,
it wouldn't be as much as
I've
the
never
cows.
one who thinks that the human species is at real threat of becoming extinct. I think it's all the non-humans that are really at risk.
They've already,
yeah, not as much as the cows.
The non-humans have already taken the blow. I think I like the point of view of like the fact, first of all, that humans have been around for hundreds of thousands of years, experimenting with organizations and living animistic life for so long.
Mm-hmm.
And I just hope and sort of assume that those lives were pretty cool, you know, like many of them were fun and funny and just like life. Like, I guess just like we live our life, like it's meaningful, it's not meaningful, it's cool, but potentially it was really meaningful. Imagine living animistic, like where you really see a soul and a spirit in everything around you. It sounds like being tripping out constantly, actually, in many ways. And in fact, they were like, people were potentially so much more in tune that it was like a heightened state of being. In that world, maybe someone who's really into anything these days is in a heightened state of being in a specific way. But so first of all, there was such a big, long period of time of humans living before the current trajectory of blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm. Like maybe like pre-agricultural, pre-Bronze Age. Yeah, I don't know how far. Yeah, but like for the bigger expanse of anatomically modern humans is like 200,000 years ago to the present, and it's only in like the last 10,000 or so. I mean, it depends on where you mark that. You know, some people call it the, you know, where does the Anthropocene begin or the shift? You know, it depends on how you define where we actually are, what this is. But
yeah,
so you're saying that the majority lived in a pretty consistent way that we've kind of lost track of it almost entirely today.
Yeah, maybe like a really, really amazing way. Who knows? And then this is just a big bang, like a hyper acceleration of, you know, resource consumption and all the rest. But even in a bigger picture, like the whole story of the planet and the humans coming along and then creating our own apocalypse or extinction event. It's like, I used to think, you know, was this a murder going on, or you know, the term raping Mother Earth, but then I would sort of see it as like maybe it's like Mother Earth masturbating because she is sort of in control, you know, like it's like a crazy masturbation that's pleasurable but like destructive at the same time. Just another experience for the huge planet to have created. Realistically, ultimately, we might have some agency or think we do. There's political systems and things, but it's also just what's unfolding after 70 million years since the last mass extinction, or so, since the last reset.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. We all need a reset here and there, you know. So, and I think that's a great climax as well. But before I let you go, buddy, I want to ask you for a couple recommendations. Do you have any recommendations, book, film, album, to share with folks who may be listening? I hope there's at least somebody other than you and I. Could be mix or match. Could be like 3 of each, 2 and 1, or 1, 1, 1. Anything at all. What comes to your mind?
Well, I feel a bit sort of embarrassed that I don't have much to recommend. Like, what am I doing with my time? I'm not engaging in any culture, haven't seen anything. But I think I'm a bit behind the time, but I did recently see in the start.
Well, you could recommend something else, if you want to recommend like go smell a flower today of this kind, or like an experience. You could recommend a non-media related experience if you'd like as well, but I'll let you can choose.
Well, I'll get to that one, but I will say, like, I was late to the train, but Kneecap, the Irish band, and their film of the same name that came out last year is really cool. It's about like these young Irish guys who start rapping and they're bringing their language back, and the film is like one of those ones that starts and you're into it, and you don't get out of it till it stops. Like, it's just go 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 in the best possible way, and it stars the people who make the band themselves. And the album that they released last year is really cool too. Like, really cool. Kneecap. It's like, yeah,
Awesome.
anti-colonial anthems. But on the note of just general experiences, why don't we chuck in? I took my friend for a bike ride that hadn't been for a bike ride for a long time, and then I was just like, yeah, she had such a good time. I was like, she almost didn't come, and I was like, well, you got to say yes to like new experiences, and I think that's something to always just try and embrace in our lives, is do something new.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation with
Andrew George.
The Deadbeat Philosophy Podcast is a co-production of Deadbeat Media and the Museum Hegelhaus Stuttgart. For more Deadbeat content and to chip in to keep the channel going, check us out at deadbeatphilosophy.substack.com. For more about the Museum Hegelhaus, check out hegelhaus.de. That's HEGEL-HAUS.de. Adios and auf Wiedersehen.